Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 251 of the Avatar Online podcast, and this is going to be one of our regular episodes. I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on today's podcast, we have a couple of pieces of news. Some of it's kind of interesting, but nothing too huge just yet. And then we'll be jumping back into our kind of Avatar and Korra rewatch reviews with one episode of Avatar that's going to be The Blue Spirit and one episode of Korra, and that's going to be Out of the Past. So we'll jump in with the news, and we'll start with this one. So on this week's episode of the Braving the Elements podcast, Janet Varney and Dante Basco had Tim Hedrick on for an episode they sort of, I suppose, basically themed as the sort of intro to the Avatar comics kind of style podcast. And they used Tim Hedrick as the sort of intro here. An interesting one, given that like he's only worked on some of the recent comics and then some of the earlier ones, but really wasn't involved in like most of the comics. But the news here actually comes from like right at the end of the podcast, like literally last minute wrapping things up. And they basically just talk about how, hey, you guys should probably read the comics because there's Avatar Studios stuff coming up. And so the quote is interesting. Tim Hedrick at the end says, read the comics because it is only going to enrich your experience going forward. You're going to know more about what is happening. You may even recognize some characters that you haven't gotten to meet yet. So they all seem to kind of agree with this idea. So very much teasing the idea. In future Avatar Studios projects, we will see some of the characters that are currently like comics only characters jump into animation in some of these Avatar Studios projects. And obviously people have been speculating, but the likelihood here is probably the likes of obviously like Ursa, I suppose to some degree is a bit of a comics only character because we haven't seen her make an appearance in a new animation yet. Noran, Key, Toph's metal bending students, characters like say Melina, if like Hakoda is going to be involved in stuff. It makes sense that these characters are going to be involved because we roughly, I think, have a sense for where the Avatar movie is going to be set, and there's certain things that you just can't avoid doing. But it's nice to get sort of confirmation here that like read the comics because you'll get a heads up on information. So what are your thoughts on this little sort of tiny Avatar Studios information?
Yeah, that is a bit small there, but I think it's something that, like you said, we were all pretty much expecting since, we've already known from before that they weren't going to like veto anything, outright that happened in the comics. So just hearing this just makes, more confirmed that they are going to be in the movies and whatever else to some degree, as much as it applies to, the stories that they're trying to tell. So definitely seems like it'll be help. I mean, I'm sure like we've talked about before that they're going to do, something within whatever media property that they're doing, first that's actually going to like explain a lot of it. Because, yeah, there is the comics and, plenty of people have read them, but realistically, not everyone's going to read them or, find out about them on YouTube or anything like that. So of course they'll have something in whatever it is to like sort of catch people up, but it'll definitely help for sure if you do, read the comics or listen to someone else who breaks them down like you do all the time. Just to be like up to date with it. So it's cool to see that. It'll be nice to see them in a animated form, just to see how, that works and everything, and what their voices, who they cast for those voices of characters that, we either haven't seen in a while, or maybe they're changing their voices, or they've never got a voice. So it's definitely really cool to see.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting one. Yeah, like we are probably going to get to see like kind of casting announcements made for the likes of like Ki and like Ikem, Noran, those type of things, and that's going to be really exciting because like, oh, it's a known character and stuff like that. So there's that. Otherwise, like if you are familiar with the comics, I don't really think that you have to listen to this podcast. It's not as insightful as you maybe think it is. There's a few interesting points, like they discuss Azula. so he answers a question about the whole Mei Zuko relationship. I think he's aware that like he's not going to like answer anything significant, and so I think he plays up like sort of like teasing fans with the answers to the questions of like, oh, maybe this is going to happen, maybe this is going to happen. So I don't really want to go too much into it, but like, all I'll say is just that, like, you know, I definitely had a little bit of a frustrated reaction to these things. It's just like they've been broken up for 10 years. Like, can we please just kind of finally answer this thing? There's no need for this to be a spoiler, really, what's happening with that relationship. And then I wasn't the happiest with the way they discussed Azula, because they more or less like went down the avenue of kind of thinking like, no, she's just staying bad or whatever. But again, they weren't really spoiling the comics, and so the lack of sort of acknowledging Smoke and Shadow existing, I guess, is just kind of part of that. But yeah, just a tiny little update there. The next piece of news is much more interesting, and so there's a kind of few layers to this, because we kind of heard about this in sort of like stages, and we still don't really know where we stand with it right now. But one of the long sort of rumored like Avatar video games has finally had some information come out about it. This one is called Avatar: The Last Airbender Quest for Balance. And so the way we heard about this first was that just randomly Amazon Japan had listings up for this game. No details, no cover, and nothing apart from the title of the game had any like Avatar information in it. It had some like really weird information about apparently what systems it was going to come out on. That obviously turned out to not be completely accurate. But what it did say was that the publisher was Game Mill, and that the release date was apparently November 8th, 2022. Then Avatar News posted an update saying that he has seen some footage of this from his kind of insider source and can confirm November 8th is in fact the release date for this game. He confirms that it's coming out on PS4, PS5, Xbox One/Xbox Series consoles, Nintendo Switch, and PC. So all the stuff like the previous one said that like it was coming out on like DS was all kind of like completely wrong. In terms of the details, it's not particularly detailed what he says about it, even though he's seen footage. He just says in his mind the art style looks like Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but that the gameplay is not open world. And then I think the only other real thing in terms of gameplay he says is just he answered someone on Twitter and said that like he did see footage of like Aang exploring an area. So you are controlling the characters, walking around some sort of an environment. But other than that, we don't really know what it is. The most interesting part of Avatar News' article was just that he says what the framing for the game is. And that is that, yes, it is an Avatar: The Last Airbender game. And it is going to be covering the events of Book 1, 2, and 3. But it is going to be from the perspective of Pakku, Bumi, Iroh, the Order of White Lotus members, retelling these events like after the fact. So they're having like a meetup and discussing old war stories, and this is what happens here. So Pakku apparently tells the events of Book 1, Bumi the events of Book 2, and Iroh the events of Book 3. But the kind of gimmick here is that their memories aren't foolproof, and that you'll end up playing through alternate histories different from what happened in the show, kind of like an Avatar What If. So that's basically everything we have right now. Gamescom like happened this week, wasn't announced during like a bunch of the events where it could have been announced. So we're in a really weird spot where this game is out in 2.5 months, and there's not really any like official information out there about it, which doesn't give a lot of people hope. There's been very mixed reactions to this, of everyone basically thinking this is going to be like an absolutely terrible game, just because in this era for video games, you only announce a game this close to release if it's not good. So Greg, what are your thoughts on the whole saga of Quest for Balance and what's happening with this Avatar video game?
Yeah, the whole I don't know. It's been weird just the whole way that it's been announced, from just like the rumors and the listing to, getting this set of information from really only one particularly news outlet, which has, generally a pretty good record. So, that's why we're talking about it and stuff like that. And to be fair, it has been reported other places as well, but no, it's also like, where are all these places getting their reporting from? Like, a lot of them are referencing like the listing that was on Amazon and other places. So I don't know, I definitely can see why a lot of people are hesitant or a grain of salt with everything that's coming out here. I mean, from the details that we're hearing from it, if they're led to be true, I mean, it sounds interesting, but I can see why, if it's coming out so quick and it has this sort of like overarching framing for how the game's going to be played, so that it gives you the control as the user to sort of like choose your own journey within what we know as the established story. I can see why a lot of people would be a bit leery on it, and the fact that it is coming out relatively quick from what we thought, at least. It definitely doesn't inspire like the highest level of confidence. And, we've seen other stuff that's coming out too as well. So that's like, there's, I don't know, a grain of salt with everything that's coming out. I mean, at the core of it, like the idea of it doesn't sound like the worst thing ever, characters that we know are framing the story. I'm assuming, if they're going that route, maybe they're doing like a whole sort of like voiceover narration, until you're sort of player controlling the actual character and all stuff like that. So, I could see why it might be like an interesting retelling of it, but, from what a lot of people have expressed online in terms of, their ideal type of Avatar game, it definitely doesn't, mesh with what a lot of people have suggested or would hope for, which is, why a lot of people were thinking that, it wouldn't be coming out this year, it would be coming out like next year, if that, in terms of being like early, especially if they're doing it, the optimal way or something like that. So yeah, this definitely seems interesting in terms of like how it's going to be received overall. I mean, I guess I'm really curious to see like what's like the pricing scheme for it and how that's going to go down, because I think that's probably like the easiest telling way to determine, the quality of the game, despite, any deals and stuff like that. So I don't know. There's a lot that could go with this, and I guess we're kind of waiting to see if this is all true and everything. But yeah, it's definitely an odd one.
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of this, definitely. Like, obviously, part of the reaction is not really realistic from, I think, a lot of people, of like expecting the first Avatar game out of nowhere to be this amazing AAA, best game ever. Like, I think we were always going to start off with something like this, that is basically just a new ATLA game. And I suppose the problem is that in like the last 10 years, there haven't really been that many just, sort of like generic IP games. Like, it feels like that era was like the early 2000s, and we haven't got that stuff like since. So it feels like it's just going to be like, okay, a 2020 era version of one of those games. Let's see how this goes. At the very least, it seems like Avatar News is sort of impressed with the art style, which I guess is cool, like sort of cell kind of shaded. That could be pretty good. But yeah, in terms of gameplay, like it doesn't really say what it is, of course. Now, to be fair, I think he answered someone on Twitter and said that like he's not much of a gamer himself, so it's the kind of unfortunate situation where like the one person with like access to the insider information is probably not the most suited to discuss it. But my guess is that this is probably going to be some sort of a like basic, you have sort of like arenas, you walk around them, run around them, and you have combos. I guess it's going to like structurally somewhat resemble the core video game, but maybe not have as like nuanced like combat. If it's maybe something like, say, the kind of, what's it, like Hyrule Warriors, kind of Fire Emblem Warriors style games, that could be kind of fun. If it's just like, okay, you're just smashing around a bunch of enemies, doing the kind of elemental combos, that could be something fun. Personally, that's kind of all I really am looking for out of like this first Avatar video game, is just like, unless it looks absolutely awful when we get to see it, I'm probably going to get it just because it's been so long since the last video game. Um, and I'm just interested to play it, and at least it looks like it will have some new element here with the Order of the White Lotus stuff, and depending on what road they go down with the what ifs, that could be sort of interesting. And then it might also give us some sense for like voice actors. What voice actors are they getting for this game? Is that a hint as to maybe Avatar's the first one up? Is this just going to be a whole different group of voice actors just because it's a kind of low level video game? But then people have also brought up the idea that like, oh, this is Game Mill. They were the same publisher on the All Star Brawl game, which controversially, when it launched, and I have no idea if it actually does now, didn't ever have like voice acting in it. I think they said they were going to, but I forget if they actually did or not. But the idea here is like, okay, are they just getting basic voice acting, or will it be a sense for what Avatar Studios is actually going to do, in terms of like, are we going to be getting like Mae Whitman here, Jack DeSena, or other people in to voice them? Other than that, like, he does say at the very end, it will have a relatively big marketing push, so keep an eye out very soon. So they're obviously going to have to start talking about this game somewhat soon. Because I'm pretty sure we only found out about All-Star Brawl not that long before it actually ended up coming out. So I assume it's just going to be another similar thing like that. But I don't know where it's going to get announced unless it just gets randomly announced somewhere. Because there's New York Comic Con, but that's not really about video games a lot of the time. So we'll see what they do there. I don't know. My main thing here is just that like, once this is like okay, I think we're fine, because I think we know there's like 4 or 5 Avatar video games in development. Avatar News has said that before. We'll get, I think, more higher budget games as we go on. That's, I think, just the way it's going to work out. This is the one to sort of like tie in, kind of be in a way kind of the cash grab, just because of how popular Avatar has been. We'll see if they cover any like when this started development, that sort of thing. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? Expectations for this? Like, are you interested in this? Are you going to get it when it comes out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely interested in it. I mean, as someone's doing this podcast, of course I'm interested in it. So I don't know. I mean, I think for me, it's really going to come down to just sort of the type of game it really is. If it's sort of like, what you're saying, where it's just sort of like a battle arena game, or if it's more of like a on rails adventure story type of game, just that, it's alternative with what you're actually doing, or, if it's something maybe in between there. I mean, there's plenty of ways they can try to frame it, and keep it within, I guess, whatever sort of overarching sort of budget that they have for this type of game that they're developing. I mean, despite what we know from the publisher, I wonder who's like actually developing the game and sort of what resources they have, because if they have sort of the techniques down for sort of the cell shading and the sort of core mechanics, then maybe it could be a lot better than we actually think it will be. But again, everything goes down to what they want to put into it, and if this is like one of the early games just to sort of get the ball rolling on things, then probably tapered expectations is probably better to have than something really sort of out there, which like you said, probably wouldn't happen until we actually get something media wise that actually shows to investors that this is actually a franchise that's worth investing. Because it does have like all the hype, and some of us are still talking about it till this day, but in the grand scheme of things, it really only goes so far. So definitely interested in it. Probably pick it up for the PC if it comes out, and we'll see how much it actually costs to how quick I try to actually buy it.
Yeah, the price is definitely going to be a big thing. If this is a full like $60 game, I think a lot of people are going to be like run away from it if it doesn't look like there's much depth to it. But if it's that sort of like $40 sort of more budget game, like I think All Star Brawl was, then it's going to be like, okay, that seems relatively.
I think it even went lower too.
Yeah. So that could definitely work in its favor. It's coming out to like all the platforms basically that are currently active, so that's good as well. And I suppose it just speaks to the idea of like, okay, like I doubt this game is going to be some like graphical powerhouse. So which version you get it on, I suppose, isn't going to particularly matter that much. The one thing I do think here is interesting is that I guess this is going to be launching roughly the same time as I suppose Avatar Generations goes live, and those two together probably will like really determine the kind of future of Avatar video games. I think Avatar Generations is going to make a lot of money, and that's probably going to be the thing that really highlights to, I suppose, a lot of the business people that like, oh, hey, Avatar is really popular. If we like make a good game, we could also make a lot of money. And if Quest for Balance does even okay, given that it has like so little hype and people aren't expecting much, then people will be like, wow, imagine we put effort in or something like that. But we don't know, and that's the thing. Like right now, I think most people are sort of assuming this is going to come out and get like 5 out of 10s across the board from all the major review sites, when it could very well come out and like be like a solid like 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 game. We just don't know just yet. But yeah, I have no clue when it's going to get announced. Like, how do you think they'll actually go about doing this, given that, like, if even like a week or two passes, they're like within 2 months from launch?
Yeah, I mean, if they didn't put it at Gamescom, which is where, everyone normally looks for things, then I mean, they really can do it like, within any time within their 2 months frames and just, drop it on like IGN or any other sort of standard places, or just, social media outreach, which I suspect they would do anyway regardless. So I don't know. I mean, if they're really not doing some sort of crazy push for it, and it's not going to be like a crazy market thing or whatever, then it really can be anywhere really, or anytime, I guess, relatively.
And then last piece of news is just some more Netflix live action show casting pieces of information. So we have Joel Ouellette has been cast as Han. So okay, Han's going to be in the show. Nathaniel Arcand has been cast as Chief Arnook. Megwon Fairbrother has been cast as Avatar Karuk. What else do we have here? Irene Bedard has been cast as Yagoda. We have a May's actress as well. That is Thalia Tran has been cast as May. So we have the whole Ozai's Angels lineup now at this point. And the last two, I think, here, Ryan Ma has been cast as Fire Navy Officer Lieutenant Dang, who is apparently a completely new original character. The first one since Suki's mother. And then the most recent casting information is that Francois Chow has been cast as the Great Sage of the Fire Temple. He's probably one of the only actors I actually know from previous stuff, mainly just because I watched Lost and there's like 3 Lost actors in the show. That's my main knowledge of any of these actors. But it means that like we have like a lot of casting information at this point, and it really points to the idea that like for the most part, I'd say the main notable kind of one we don't have any information on yet is probably like Zhong Zhong. Otherwise, it's the likes of sort of like Bato, Haru, Tyro type characters are the ones that we don't know about. And some of those are kind of like, okay, I can see them why they're maybe skipping over that stuff. They're keeping other sort of notable characters. But Zhong Zhong seems to be the main one that's sort of missing in all of this. Now, they might keep his reveal until later on, but it's weird if they don't, because this is the book where Zhao is in it, and the whole Zhao Zhong Zhong connection is like one of the main kind of gimmicks with those two. So we'll see what happens there. But do you have any thoughts on this kind of recent batch of casting information?
No, not much. Some of them I do recognize, but no, not too much. Just glad that they're keeping going with it and everything, which I guess is just all the build up to the hype to it actually coming out.
Yeah, and then the one original character here, Avatar News, like he hyped this up I think the day beforehand. It's like, oh, new original character, and I think everyone was just a little bit like, oh, it's just a fire officer, okay, because the thing here is that okay, that might be a new name, of course, like we've never heard before, but that might just be like giving a name to one of the random officers who speaks in one of the episodes at some point, rather than like a proper like role that's being given to like someone else. Like this might just be the name of like Zhao's second in command or something like that. We don't really know if there's anything significant there. Like I don't think there's going to be too much going on with just a random lieutenant guy. Other than that, like I think he mentioned some stuff. Like I think we had roughly already known this before, but just the idea is that like Karuk obviously was never in book one, and they seem to be actually like fleshing out Avatar Karuk and involving him more in the Northern Water Tribe arc at the end. So it seems like they're actually going to be sort of utilizing the more recent information from the novels we have, and using past avatars more regularly in the show rather than rarely doing it like they did in the series, which could work out relatively well. I think that's like one unique thing that the show can do, is that they have like hindsight to their advantage, and they can just be like, hey, we don't need to wait all the way until this time for this one. We can bring this thing up, and that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I'm definitely at the point now where I just want to see something with this show. I think there's a Netflix event coming up in September at some point that I think even Avatar News had kind of mentioned as like, this is the time I think they'll finally like actually reveal something about the show. Because what's weird about the show is that it feels like we're getting regular information, but all of it's like leaked information technically, because Avatar News has like an insider like information. They've only like officially announced like maybe like 5-10 at most actors in the show. Everything else is like, I think, just stuff people have kind of figured out, not really officially said. Which is kind of weird, since we've known about the Netflix show for so long, how secretive they've been about it, especially when it is just an adaptation. But I think that's just Netflix in general with production stuff. So I don't really know what the situation is there. Because I'm guessing this has to be launching 2023. I'd be very surprised if we don't see anything this year. But when do you think they'll actually give us our first look at the show?
Yeah, I mean, I would think it would be sometime this year, but I don't really know at this point, because it is odd the way that Netflix does a lot of their stuff, usually, and especially since the way that they normally put stuff out, which is just all in one go. It doesn't usually have like a big ramp up period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess with this show, because like we already know it, because it's an adaptation, they're probably going to release the full season at once, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's all the news that there's been for now. We're pretty much just waiting for information on like everything. There's like a couple of kind of like more reprint style books that we're getting towards the end of the year. Patterns in Time in November might have some interesting new stuff, but again, by the time it comes out, there'll be like 20-30 new pages of content in that. But at least there's something for the remainder of the year. Otherwise, we're just waiting for like the official announcement of a lot of those books that got announced at Comic-Con, to see what the description for like the Azula comic is, the official announcement of the new Korra comic, any Avatar Studios news, any Netflix news, and then the video game news, I suppose, is actually something that could be happening in the next few months, because they're slowly doing the Generations launch over the next couple of months. And yeah, apparently we have an actual console video game out in like just over 2 months, which is kind of crazy to think about. But it's very on brand for Avatar to just have like no information about all this stuff. I hope that changes as we kind of go into next year and things are a little bit more open. The more time goes on, I'm just like, why is there no official Avatar website? Like, I think that's just a major problem with the franchise at this point. That I think the social media needs to be a lot better on this stuff. I get a lot of it's sort of like leaked information, but I think they need to communicate better, and hopefully they will. But from there, we'll go into our reviews for this episode. We're going to start with the Avatar episode, and that is 113, The Blue Spirit. So obviously we've done all the episodes up until this point, and we're here on episode 13. So, pretty significant book one episode here, one of the more notable ones from this book, and very interesting the timing here that we're reviewing this just after the dawn of
Yeah.
Yang Chen, because there's a couple of Yang Chen connections here with the Yuyan Archers, the fact that this is the episode of Avatar that involves Taku, one of the Shang cities, and just in general, it's a very, I think, good episode. Definitely like up there with the best, like probably like 5, 6, 7 episodes of the book. But what are your general thoughts on the Blue Spirit?
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those episodes that stands out for in a lot of people's minds, for the Union Archers, just for, the idea of Zuko and the Blue Spirit, just for seeing different ways of, Aang using his abilities. I think it has, a real sense of, stuff needs to get done in this episode, despite, its pretty strong focus on, our two, main characters or, anti-hero character, at least at this point in time. So yeah, it definitely is one that stands out for a lot of people for a lot of good reasons.
Mm-hmm. So, we actually start this episode straight away with the introduction of the Yuyan Archers. And it's a cool intro, and in general, they have a relatively, good run across this episode. It is, in a way, weird that they never use the Yuyan Archers again in ATLA the show. Of course, we have, like, Bashir as part of the Rough Rhinos, who kind of ends up being revealed to be a Yuyan Archer, and we learn more about him through the comics. But it's interesting that up until basically the last couple of months, we basically knew next to nothing about the whole idea of the Yuyan Archers, and it's all RPG information, now Dawn of Yang Chen information, that's actually developing more on... This is not just a random group of archers in the Fire Nation military. There's much more to this. This is kind of like a spiritual group that has been sort of, in a way, almost kind of like tainted by being part of the military here. But they are made out to be like absolutely incredible, because obviously like they defeat and capture Aang, which is something that like so many of the characters struggle to do, but this group does that. So what were your thoughts on how the Yuyan Archers were used here, and I suppose in the whole show, because this is like their only appearance?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny retrospectively thinking about that, but I think it's one of those instances where, like, you have these characters, you develop them for the story, you develop them for this episode, and, some of the characters that, the creators and the team that worked on the show, they, just sort of land and they have like a bigger sort of role that people either put on them or just can be fleshed out. And other characters, you sort of just like, forget and throw it to the wayside, and they just happen to be just enough interest on them that, they have, they've garnered enough sort of like attention just to, propel them into, the characters that or the sort of like group that we know them of now, where they've, expanded them on, multiple comics and now in books. And now they have, sort of this whole sort of thing behind them that makes them way more interesting than, they might have originally thought that they were actually going to be. So it's funny how that works out. But yeah, I mean, seeing them in this episode, it's cool to see them in action and see sort of, this version of them at least, and how they're being used in the military, and, like you said, like how, skillful they are. I mean, we don't see as much of their sort of like spiritual side and the practice on terms of that in this episode, because, of course, probably at this time that wasn't as, fleshed out as well. But, to see, their abilities, how they're actually able to capture Aang, how Zhao, speaks of their abilities and how, famed they are known for, which, makes you wonder maybe why there isn't more of them. But I'm sure, there's a whole bunch of different techniques and reasons for that and whatnot. But no, I think it's really cool to see, how they're used here. I mean, we don't really get that much of them. It's too bad. I mean, for such cool characters, we really don't see too much of them, like you said.
Yeah, and obviously, like, we only get the idea that, okay, their legacy is that they're pinpoint archers. They can, what is it, like, hit a fly to a tree from who knows how long away. And then obviously in later material we find out that, okay, it's a spiritual kind of art form from like Uzuku Yuyan, and then before that, Jujinta is from like a clan, we guess, of Yuyan. Um, and
Yeah.
again, it's spiritual in nature. There seems to be some element of like, if you're a Yuyan archer, you technically almost like can't miss. And I think they kind of keep that up because I don't think none of the Yuyan archers speak in this episode, if I remember correctly. And then they do have the whole thing of like the tattoos on their faces, so they definitely present them as being different than just like a random sort of specialized military unit. Not like they're very different than like the Rough
Hmm.
Rhinos or something like that. There is something sort of special to them that it seems like Colonel Shainu is sort of like almost aware of that, and that's why he's being sort of protective of them. Of like, no, they stay here. Uh, you don't get to use this group for like random missions. You know that they're important. But because of that, it means like, wait, why don't they use them in other situations? I suppose we probably miss most of the main battles where they might have been used off screen, but it's an interesting one for sure. But the other part of this scene is obviously we get the idea of like, okay, Colonel Shainu here, it's Commander Zhao, but then he gets promoted, and that's the only reason why he actually is able to gain control of the UN archers is because he gets a promotion like right there on the spot. He's made an admiral. And this has been the whole kind of idea of Zhao's kind of character, and we see that in this episode as well. The whole idea of everything he does is to try and impress basically the Fire Lord, and he even talks about wanting like his speech sent to the Fire Lord in this episode, and you see
Yeah.
the ambition from him completely here, and but also the kind of cleverness. He is a good tactician. He's able to be aware of like this group is something I need under my control to capture the Avatar, and it works. Like he succeeds completely. It's like the cleanest capture of Aang in like the entire series, basically, more or less. So, what are your thoughts on Zhao in this episode?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, he does his job, as a villain, as an antagonist, pretty well for the most part in terms of just, being a presence there that's trying to oppose Aang and, the whole group and everything like that. And, using his abilities, like you can't say that it does seem sometimes that he's like sort of like falling like up the chain and he's sort of getting these accolades, maybe, not all of them seem to be, quite justified, but, we're assuming that he's doing other stuff as well, maybe. Or, he's just able to stand out just enough that, he's been recognized by the Fire Lord just enough to get these sort of, upgrades in his status in the military here. But yeah, I think you definitely see that, he does have some tactician skills here. He has, despite, where he eventually ends up, later in the series, like he does have, at least initially some level of patience. It's just, how long does it last in various different cases, or can he control it well enough to always sort of come out the victor? But yeah, no, you definitely get to see, sort of his abilities and sort of, he really is trying to just like sort of become as high as he can in the military structure and, is all for sort of like the war and, is completely, brought up into sort of like the current Fire Nation ideals that they've had for, the last couple generations here. So no, he's definitely bought into everything that the Fire Nation is trying to sell here and is willing to use pretty much any resources and definitely can see the worth of the Union archers here. And, it definitely seems like they're like, probably like one of the most, specialized units that they have that's like effective, especially for what he needs to do for capturing Aang, since pretty much nothing else has worked for the most part.
Hmm. Yeah, like this episode is I think is very interesting for Zhao because I think you can easily look back on the character and feel like, oh, he was just this kind of really low level character who happened to have a lot of power. But I think you can see that there's a lot more actual like potential. He is a lot more intelligent in terms of his power as a bender as well. He's probably better than you actually think because like obviously he was trained by Zhang Zhang, so there had to have been a core potential there for him to be like picked out as the next in line for Zhang Zhang. He got a lot of that training. He just kind of like you mentioned there chose to do things in the more sort of modern Fire Nation way, which goes away from a lot of the traditions that actually make you sort of a better bender and stuff like that. And we see here, like, he is a good strategist, and we'll see that coming up in future episodes, the whole plan with the moon and stuff like that. He's just kind of, in a way, brought down by everything he does is to try and make himself look the best possible. That even if it's a really good plan, he always does it where, like, and I have to be the one to benefit from this in the end. There's an element of, like, pettiness to him that if he got rid of, he'd be so much more effective. And I think that's the whole Shainu thing here, of just, he's kind of like, I get hunting down the Avatar, but in the grand scheme of the war, it's a little bit of a kind of frivolous pursuit that we can't put our best units on at the moment. Where Zhao is just kind of thinking, like, Ozai would promote me to, like, right-hand man if I deliver Aang to his doorstep, and that's the only reason he's doing that. Plus, you also get the slight sense of he likes messing up Zuko every time they kind of encounter each other, and the fact that they get into this quite heated rivalry kind of speaks to the kind of issue for both of them, of, like, Zuko not controlling his anger. And then for Zhao, it's like, you're powerful enough to where, like, you shouldn't be, like, almost like afraid of Zuko, but you've let him get into your head very, very heavily in all of this. But it's an interesting dynamic, and at the end of this opening scene, we do get a first glimpse of the Blue Spirit, which I suppose is what we should talk about next. Obviously, straight away, like, the big thing is that the Blue Spirit is at the end of the episode revealed to be Zuko. But it's very interesting to just consider, like, what's going on here. We find out over the course of the episode that Zuko basically gets limited by Zhao, who has just got a promotion. So Zhao has all the power in the world to control where Zuko can or can't go, and effectively stops his movement to the point where Zuko feels that he won't be able to pursue the Avatar anymore because Zhao just has so much power and control over the military. And this creates this situation where he is losing his hope, which is the whole setup from the previous episode, is that Iroh says when describing Zuko's backstory is that the Avatar gives Zuko hope that things can return to the way they want to be, and he's beginning to lose that. And so this is where he takes on this sort of alter ego, new identity of the Blue Spirit. What's your thoughts on the Blue Spirit in terms of, I suppose, from Zuko's kind of point of view, the kind of psychology of him choosing to take on this, like, other character to do what he does in this episode and the other times when he takes on this role?
Yeah, no, that is like an interesting aspect of Zuko, because it's really him, like, you know, it definitely seems like that's almost like his desperation move. Like, he's, you know, he's so distraught over, you know, all of the hope, like you said, of him not being able to at least attempt to return to what he had before, that he's willing to sort of, like, don this alter ego that's, you know, essentially going against, in a way, you know, the Fire Nation and what they're trying to do. Because, you know, like, realistically, if he's really, you know, going all for the Fire Nation and doesn't care about himself in any sort of way, then, you know, he should just let Zhao capture him, right? But, you know, he like Zhao has, you know, this sort of self-importance, whether it's because of, you know, he views it through, like, his honor, or, you know, just because of his own self-interest, you know, something that's, you know, driving him personally in towards of, you know, wanting to be the one that captures Aang, you know, himself, the Avatar himself here. So it definitely, you know, it adds, you know, another layer of his character that, you know, you can try to figure out. You know, I mean, I guess, you know, the whole idea of him being sort of like, you know, this fake sort of villain, you know, is always there, because he's never really a villain. Like, he's always, you know, has like a core of his character that is generally good. So, you know, for the most part, you really don't consider him, even though you try to, or they try to make it seem like he's a villain throughout the show, but he always has like a moral center to himself that, you know, he never really crosses, you know, regardless of almost any situation that he's in there, versus Zhao, who's pretty much doesn't care about like anything. Like, he's just willing to go for it for the Fire Nation and for his own self-interest here. So to see Zuko, you know, take this other personality, and it looks like, you know, even from the beginning, you know, you get when you first get the glimpse of the blue spirit there, you can like he already knows that something is going on. Even before the actual officers board the ship and tell him that like he can't go anywhere with his for the search of the Avatar here. So like he already has a sense of things that are sort of like falling apart from the beginning here, and he's already willing to go through such lengths in order to achieve his own goals, even if he has to sort of like backtrack the Fire Nation's overall sort of plans.
Yeah, I like what you said at the start there, the idea like that the blue spirit is sort of like Zuko like at his most desperate, and it's where he in this role does things that in a way are like very, very dishonorable, as we'll go in more the kind of book 2 arc with the blue spirit of like he steals things, again highlighting the dishonor aspect of it, and especially when you bring in like the extra detail they gave us from like the comics to explain like a lot of the look and stuff like that the mask that he wears obviously is symbolic, because it's the villain basically from Love Amongst the Dragons, which has a connection to his mother because his mother loved the theater and especially this play in particular. But then there's the connection from his past that it's this mask in particular because he was basically always forced by Azula to play the character who always loses in the play. And so it's sort of symbolic that when it comes to Azula, Zuko always considers himself the weak one and the loser of the two. And so it's kind of very fitting in a way that he takes on this role using that mask where he never uses his firebending because that's the thing he's bad at compared to Azula, and actually utilizes the skill where he's actually one of like the best in the entire series. Like if you put Zuko into the non-bender fighter category, he's right up there actually, because he's right up there against the likes of probably Piandao, Ty Lee, Suki. There's not that many characters who seem as skilled as Zuko when it comes to the swordplay. So that's always like an interesting aspect of it. And they ultimately like where they settle on the blue spirit is that for Zuko to grow, he has to completely discard this kind of aspect of himself that sort of, in a way, like represents him considering himself like a failure. So I always like that this is like his desperation mode thing, where he has no hope, and that losing it is kind of the key to it. But that sort of Zuko at his best is sort of the character that we saw from the past, but also utilizing this, that hey, he's good at swords as well. Incorporate that in, but do things in the right way. So it's a kind of complicated one in that like they never full on like make that exact statement of like a in-depth character kind of thing with the blue spirit, but it's all there to sort of like kind of figure it out ultimately. But do you have any thoughts on some of that kind of extra sort of symbolism they added onto the whole blue spirit and the other material?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always, that's like sort of like just understanding his character and sort of him developing over time, which, even from like probably this episode, they might not have foreseen like how far this sort of, idea of his character, the mask, where it comes from, how it relates to his family, how it relates to the play, how he sort of like views himself as a character, just sort of develops over time. And yeah, if he uses all of his abilities, the firebending and the sword play and, his just whole upbringing, then, it really would make sort of the possible best character that he could potentially be, which puts him on the right side of things, which is sort of where he was really always just he was questioning everything, his honor, his people, his country, his nation, and it's just something that they have to, or him as a character has to sort of like develop over time. And you can see that later on where he sort of has to like go on his own and sort of do things and figure things out, and is trying to hide his actual firebending, and where he's has to use sort of the swords as like his main thing because he's trying to sort of like hide who he is. So when he does reveal that he can do both of them, that is where you see him sort of like really sort of come to terms with things, or at least start to come to terms with things. So yeah, no, I think that's definitely a really cool aspect that, you see sort of develop later on, and with like additional media. It's not even sort of fully grasped just in sort of the show itself.
Yeah, because there's that moment like at the end of what is it, like Zuko alone, whereas it's like the one time he seems to actually use the swords and firebending together, which is actually a really powerful combination that like he only uses that one time. But character wise, he makes sort of like the wrong choice at the end there, and like he announces himself as like the prince and stuff like that. But it's like it's him almost trying to like embrace everything about the Fire Nation instead of like his actual destiny, which is to change things and not just accept them the way they were. And that's obviously part of the arc of then not too many episodes after that he kind of eventually kind of like gives up the blue spirit for good. But obviously it's a cool part of the character that whenever anyone draws like older Zuko, he always has to have the swords. So it's a great part of the character to have, because like you almost forget that like, oh yeah, he was trained by Piandao as well. So there's that. On the other side of the episode, the setup with the Aang side of the episode is that we're just randomly here in the ruins of Taku. Sokka is sick, continuity from the previous episode. They were caught in a storm. So it's actually Sokka who gets hit first with the fever, but then it's revealed, okay, Katara is also going to get hit by this as well. Aang doesn't suffer from it, which makes sense kind of retroactively when we learn the whole thing about like airbenders can regulate their kind of body temperature with airbending, so that's why Aang doesn't really suffer here. And then we get an interesting note. He doesn't bring his glider with him because there's a thunderstorm, and he's obviously a bit afraid about getting hit here. But he's going to head to the Herbalist Institute, like on the mountain across the way, to get medicine for them. That's the whole setup from there. So in terms of Dawn of Yang-Chen connection, we just see the ruins of what used to be the fourth Shang city that we don't really know much about. Like, there's information from like the website that says it was like a popular kind of like trading outpost, and it was one of the first places like the Fire Nation kind of went to take over when the war started. But that's really about it. It's an interesting setup, because like obviously the Aang side of this is great, but then the Katara, Sokka, and Momo section of the episode is like all humor, like goofy Avatar humor like we get. But what are your thoughts on this? Some kind of almost surprising continuity. We don't often get that much direct continuity between episodes, especially in book one like we do here.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that worked out pretty well. I mean, I guess, in terms of like just plot devices and stuff like that, it gives you a through line. It gives you a reason for them to be sort of like stuck in this area that, everyone just sort of seems to be converging together. But, I think it works for what they're going for. Like, they're a little bit ill here. It doesn't seem like it's the worst thing ever, but, Sokka's hallucinating a bit, and, they both have pretty bad coughs and stuff like that. So I mean, it gives a reason for Aang to sort of need to do this, and then the whole idea with him sort of having to actually go everywhere by foot, just sort of it adds towards the urgency. It limits what he can do, because realistically, if he didn't have that restriction, he could just fly all over the place and it would be done relatively quickly. So I think it works here to sort of ground him a little bit in terms of what he's able to do, and to actually need help, because that's really the whole main key thing here, is that he just happens to not be able to do everything on his own, because he's on his own. He doesn't have his normal crew of friends that's working with him, and he actually has to resort to help from someone who he doesn't quite know who it is in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that brings us to him. He relatively quickly in the episode gets to the Herbalist Institute, and we get this kind of, again, more humorous scene here where we see the herbalist has kind of been up there for more or less 40 years, like on her own. She talks about how there were others, but they left a while ago. So it's just her and her cat. And she does treat Earth Kingdom soldiers who come up here every so often, but it is mostly her on her own. So she's preparing this thing the whole time. Aang thinks it's the medicine, but it's actually just Miyuki's food. And then she reveals that, what you have to do to cure your friends is to just find some frozen wood frogs from down in the valley and just have your friends suck on them. So it's just this kind of funny cure to their illness, and he kind of heads off at that point. And it's a fun thing, of course, just this character who, like, again, we only see this one time, but it's sort of notable that she's here. I think people remember this character because she's just kind of fun and crazy, and especially the whole, like, Miyuki, did you get in trouble with the Fire Nation again? Is a kind of nice kind of little joke. Plus, regular cat, like non-hybrid animal here, so that's somewhat interesting. But do you have any thoughts on this scene here with the herbalist?
Yeah, no, it definitely does stand out, which is funny. It's like, it's a character that stands out in a lot of people's memory, but not enough towards where, you really want to come back, like sort of like the Cabbage Merchant or something along those lines, or even like, Foamy Mouth Guy. Like those characters, depending on when you see them, they might actually say like a lot less. Like the Cabbage Merchant, obviously he gets a lot more development, especially in core later on. But for the most part, some of those, funny comedic characters that we do actually see at least one or two more times, no, this one we don't really get more, but we actually hear her actually say more than I think a lot of the other ones in most cases. So, no, I think the character itself is fun. I mean, it definitely, works for the situation that we're seeing here. And, I don't know if that's ever something that they would ever even think of, like, mentioning again. But, it works for the episode and the sort of drive Aang towards, actually, getting the actual remedy.
And I did, like, you sort of get the sense from, like, the general area that we're in here, sort of Taku and the Institute, that, like, it's sort of like abandoned. There's not that many people here because it's kind of in ruins from the early years of the war. And it's only just people who sort of wander into this area that, like, have any use for anything going on here. So I kind of like that little bit of kind of showing that the world is kind of lived in, that's why this area is a mess, because like 80, 90 years ago, it was much better situation, but this is where the attacks came in initially. But after this, we basically get the big fight of the episode, at least until the Blue Spirit and Aang work together. Aang versus the Yuyan archers. Obviously, it's Aang, like, completely outnumbered. It's a whole squad against him. He doesn't have his glider, but it's still pretty good. Like, Aang obviously isn't really trying to, like, attack them. He's just trying to escape because he has to get the frogs. He's worried his friends are going to get even sicker. And it's just a lot of airbending movement. We see how kind of, skilled airbenders are at moving around. We see the airbending assisted speed. The fact that Aang can just literally leap off mountains and, like, land with no real problems is a pretty notable thing. But of course, he doesn't expect the Yuyan archers to be able to actually, like, chase him down the side of a mountain. But they, of course, have their kind of arrows with the ropes attached, so they actually are revealed to be super skilled as well. And then Aang actually fends off, like, arrow attacks pretty well. And he more or less does only get captured because he does distract himself trying to get the frogs at the same time as he's, like, fighting them. But he does eventually get captured as his clothes get, like, pinned to, like, the log nearby. But it's an interesting one because it highlights that I don't think there are that many characters who would maybe, like, one versus, like, a squad of Yuyan archers actually do that well against them. I say Earthbenders would do relatively well because they could just make, shields big enough that the arrows can't do anything. But some of the other elements, I think, would struggle against these guys here. So it shows how skilled they are, definitely. That, characters who can sort of challenge Aang's, like, agility can actually fight against him, sort of like Jet did in the trees. So that's nice to see.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on the fight that we get here?
Yeah, no, I think the agility ability is really key for pretty much a lot of things. Like, yeah, sometimes you can have, like, a lot of power moves and that can trump it in certain situations. But a lot of times, from at least a lot of the instances that we see in both of the shows, it really comes down to a lot of, like, finesse and just agility, in addition to your overall power strength. In terms of being able to best, other characters in almost any sort of situations, like, even like Ty Lee, obviously isn't like a powerhouse, but, her agility pretty much makes her, like, unmatched in being able to sort of, like, getting close to most characters in most situations. And yeah, here this case here, there is like a whole squad of the Union archers, so maybe just like one archer with a limited set of arrows might not be able to do as well. But the combined efforts of all of them, including their ability to also, have the confidence to leap off a mountain cliffside and be able to catch themselves is, speaks to their ability, speaks to how Aang's able to do pretty well. Like maybe if Aang had his glider, like you were talking about, maybe he would have been able to do a bit better. But even in that case, typical sort of like airbending tactics would probably have been to just sort of like fly away, which maybe that might have worked. Although the Union archers are able to shoot extremely long distances with high accuracy. So even that might not have been able to sort of work in this sort of case here. But no, I think, the whole chase scene is definitely pretty entertaining in order to see just sort of what they're able to do in this range, and who knows what could have really been for this result.
So yeah, this is how Aang gets captured and obviously brought to Zhao very, very directly. And yeah, we get an interesting confrontation here. Like obviously, like Zhao just kind of taunts Aang here, and we see this is one of the kind of key things with Zhao is that he's very aware of like the history here. He knows Aang's the last Airbender, and is one of the characters who tends to like bring it up quite a bit. We get it here, we get it in the comic Relics as well, which is sort of basically a follow up to this episode more kind of directly. And it is one of the few times we really get that mentioned again, that idea of like Aang has lost everyone else. He is the last Airbender. He does note here, kind of interestingly, he's not going to kill Aang because that would just mean they have to find the next Avatar. So the cycle gets brought up here, and Zhao kind of just leaves here, very confident. But then Aang does the whole airbending kind of breathing out thing to knock him over. But Zhao's confident because he has the Avatar captured in the middle of a fortress. So how is he going to get out? And that's the whole setup for like the Blue Spirit is how he gets out. But what were your thoughts on this Zhao Aang confrontation here?
Yeah, you definitely get to see, Zhao and his sort of pridefulness that he has here, just in terms of, he's the one that was able to capture the Avatar, although not him directly, but, people under his command was able to capture the Avatar. And, that definitely sets the stage for everything that he really wants to do and what he wants to accomplish, right? So, like, he pretty much thinks that he has everything said, and that leads to everything else with the speech and everything here. So no, I think it is a note that he does know the history of the airbenders and sort of how they were captured, although we find that later on. We don't really find out about any of that in the actual show, but clearly he's knowledgeable, and what he later does with the North, obviously you can see that he's pretty well learned, which is goes in line with what we were talking about earlier about just sort of his general tactical awareness that he has, and he's willing to learn and understand things in order to achieve his means. It's just maybe he should be a little bit more tactful in some cases, or not so self-interested.
And yeah, we basically do then from there see like the Blue Spirit infiltrates the fortress. Zhao gives his big speech, mentioning they've captured the Avatar. The comet's going to return. With that, they'll win the war. So, the Fire Nation addressing that, this is their kind of end goal to finish off the war. That's how they're going to defeat the Earth Kingdom. And then, from there we do get the Blue Spirit frees Aang, doesn't speak to him, of course, and they have their big, escape sequence. It's initially stealth, but then they're alerted to the fact that Aang is missing, and we get the kind of crazy action here at the end as, like, Aang and Zuko actually do work really, really well together here, as, like, Aang's using his bending, but Zuko's not using his, but he's amazing with the swords. There's a cool moment where like Aang kind of has the opportunity to just like escape out the front gate, but chooses to go back and like help his rescuer. So that's a nice moment there. But then they do eventually get surrounded. This is where the Yuan archers are brought back into play. Zuko sort of backs out holding the swords to Aang, but the archer fires, hits Zuko in the mask, and this is where Aang finds out that the Blue Spirit is in fact Zuko. But again, he doesn't leave him there. He, creates a smoke screen and does sort of drag him away into the forest. And we get the very cool kind of like ending kind of sequence of the episode where Aang reflects on the idea that in his era, he had friends in the Fire Nation, and this is where we get our like first Kuzan kind of mention. And he notes that maybe Zuko, like maybe if I'd known you back then when the situation was different, maybe we could have been friends. But Zuko just attacks Aang, and Aang leaves. Zuko can't pursue, and the episode just ends on like Aang cures Katara and Sokka, but is sort of down after what happened because like he's put in a lot of effort to make this happen, and has just had some weird stuff happen where like Zuko saved him and he thought there was some hope there, but then it immediately went away. But then interestingly, Zuko, back in his room, we get a very interesting moment where he kind of turns away from the Fire Nation symbol on the wall, highlighting that this is one of the first stages of that sort of like true shift away from things, that maybe Zuko just relentlessly going after Aang is not going to be the entirety of his arc, that here is one of the first times where it just seems like he is not really for the Fire Nation because of what happened here. So very interesting ending to the episode here. Lots of great action in the escape, and then some big dramatic moments as all the kind of reveals come out. But what are your thoughts on how this episode comes to an end?
Yeah, it's definitely very sort of, I guess, contemplative. It definitely has our characters sort of thinking about the current situation or the state of affairs of the world and how they might be different, how it used to be different when Aang was actually growing up, in his original era, towards, where things currently are. I mean, I wonder how much of it, is sort of really reflecting on sort of like Zuko and his, thought process of the state of the world. I think it's probably still too early here for him to really sort of, be at odds with the status quo of the Fire Nation. But at least in terms of, how things are going for him personally, he probably can see some cracks in the way things are going, either because of just, what Zhao is doing or just because of, how he's been treated overall. But it definitely, is a cool sort of whole ending sequence of them, escaping, working together pretty well without any sort of real like communication other than like, like head nods and stuff like that. You get to see a little bit more of the Yuyan archers here, or at least one specifically in their actual, ability and skill here, which, it also shows, I guess, a little bit more tact that, Zhao has as well, where he's, thinks he has the best sort of situation here, although I don't know, that distance there almost seems like maybe that might not have been like the smartest thing in terms of his thought process there, but maybe that's just more of his sort of like pridefulness being like the key element that actually sort of captured the Avatar. Maybe there could have been a better way of doing that. But no, I think the whole final ending sequence is really fun. And it definitely, leaves a lot of open, I guess, sort of possibilities for the future.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it is interesting because like there's a lot that goes like unsaid here of just the idea that like Zuko saves Aang, Aang saves Zuko from basically being captured by Zhao himself and keeping this identity a secret as well. And even just the idea like that Aang just sort of openly talks to Zuko about like, hey, like I had friends from the Fire Nation from like 100 years ago, the way things were before, and Zuko doesn't say anything about it, but it's very much just like kind of one of the first times like he sort of hears Aang just sort of being a normal person around him, that this is not just like the being who is the Avatar that he has to capture. Like Aang is a person who has all these things with him, and there's a slight element of that in a way maybe that's why he doesn't like in any way really move to pursue Aang when Aang runs off. It's just that like he is thinking about this a little bit, even though the episode doesn't really like have Zuko directly like ponder directly what Aang says. But what are your thoughts on that specific moment there where just the two of them are like talking in the forest and what happens there?
Yeah, I think that's like a I don't know. I wonder how much that comes into play when they, eventually do develop their friendship, and how, they reflect on like the current, status of the world, and sort of, Zuko's upbringing, or any of the Fire Nation's sort of upbringing. Like when we do see the rest of the kids in the Fire Nation Academy and stuff like that, like, how they've been taught to be, and sort of, just Aang, and like, him remembering, to him is probably not that long ago that he was playing with his friend Kuzan, and how, their friendship developed over time, and, sort of the antics that they got into, which you do get to see in one of the comics. Definitely, I don't know, it definitely, makes you think about just sort of like, which is the whole point of it, right? Is trying to make you think about like who's bad, who's good, where's the gray area here, who's been taught to be bad versus is actually bad, and, all the sort of, middling things that the show is attempting to sort of try and teach you about.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it kind of highlights again the idea that Zuko, we've never really got much from him about like him particularly supporting the war or anything like that. He's driven by just capture the Avatar, because if he brings the Avatar back to his father, his honor will be restored, and in a way his life can go back to being like quote unquote normal. But obviously, as we later find out, that normal is not really good, because it's a pretty terrible kind of situation that he's in, because Ozai basically hates him. Azula's always trying to manipulate him. So like what Zuko's actually trying to kind of return back to isn't in any way what he actually wants. And so there's a sort of significance to like Aang talking about like the Fire Nation before the war is kind of somewhat interesting, because the one kind of glimpse of like Zuko's kind of deeper feelings about things is that, oh, he doesn't want the soldiers of the Fire Nation like needlessly sacrificed, which is actually like a good thing in a leader, but he's never actively like attacking the Earth Kingdom like as like a soldier of the Fire Nation for the most part. He does it to get his uncle back, but that's like one of the only times it really happens. So it's interesting, just that idea of like Zhao directly in this episode talks about, I want to fulfill all the goals of the Fire Nation, but Zuko's just trying to make it so that his way to return things back to normal is still active, and that's really it. But yeah, very very thought-provoking episode here. But we'll move on to our Korra episode for this time out, and that is a K109 Out of the Past. So last time out, of course, 108, crazy reveal, one of the biggest kind of cliffhangers in like the entire franchise, Tarlok bloodbending, and it continues completely in this episode, in a very action-packed episode that also has just as many like incredible reveals. There's some really good like lore and kind of like world building as well in this one, and some pretty good character stuff as well. So another episode that kind of like ticks all the boxes for the most part. Not to mention this being a very hyped episode, because I think early on in Korra everyone wanted to see the older versions of like the previous cast, and this is the episode where it finally actually happens, and I think it delivers. It's incorporated really well into the plot of this book, so it wasn't just sort of like fan service for the sake of fan service. They did it really well here, to the point where like they almost like held back so much on it. We are now desperate in a way for the movie to almost be a bit more fan servicey and like show us more of the stuff that we didn't maybe get to see in Korra. But I think it was the right choice during the era of Korra not to overly kind of in a way like utilize too much of the old cast and distract from the new cast. But what are your thoughts on K109 Out of the Past?
Yeah, no, that is a point there in terms of how they choose to use it in this episode. I mean, I think overall the episode is pretty good. Like, it definitely gives you a lot with the current characters going on. It gives you, shows you some abilities. It explains some abilities that you haven't seen before. You get to see our group of core characters sort of work together. A lot of it is working without Korra because she's captured, of course, throughout this whole episode. So you get to see, different sides of them. There's, a little bit of sort of like relationship stuff in here here too as well that they try to push as well. And you get to see some sort of back dealings from current day and the past time. So yeah, no, there's a lot of, I guess, moving pieces to this one, which just really just a continuation of what we've seen so far. So in terms of just, stringing episodes together, connecting different things together, like, we sort of mentioned with the other episode for Aang, for ATLA, this one is definitely, like obviously a direct continuation of the events from before. So it definitely just works really well in terms of keeping the story going and giving things that people sort of wanted, but, weren't quite sure when we would actually get them at the time, at least.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the first thing straight away is just covering, okay, what's Tarlok doing with Korra? We find him bloodbending her into a metal prison cell high in the mountains surrounding Republic City. He then basically returns to Republic City to basically plan the story for what happens, because everyone's going to be aware that Korra is gone. The city hall is a wreck after the fight. He has to, address that. And so we see our other hero characters arrive, and Tarlok already has this planned out. We see Equalist kind of equipment all over the place, and he's basically staged this to be an Equalist attack, where he's kind of saying, like, we had a talk and both of us were attacked by the Equalists, and she got captured, I didn't, but I got injured. And I like the way, like, he is lying to, like, Tenzin as he says this, but they show us the clips of what actually happened, and he, like, shocks himself and so on. It's he puts the effort in to make this plan work, and does get people off his back for a certain amount of time, because why wouldn't you believe this? Because again, Korra went out on her own to confront Tarlok from the last episode, so no one even knows that they met. So he has that going for him as well. But again, it shows how clever he is. Like, I think we talked in the last review about how 108 like jumps Tarlok into the spotlight, that just a few episodes after, like, Amon has, like, suddenly gained massive amounts of power, taking out the pro bending arena. Now Tarlok has made this massive move. Like, who is the bigger villain? Who's the bigger threat in all of this? And you're kind of leaning towards Tarlok here because of how powerful he is, and again, he's now going to have, like, control over a lot of the city. Where do we go from here? So I've always liked this section of the story here, as they build up Tarlok and showing how clever he is. But what are your thoughts on the opening section of this episode?
Yeah, they do a lot with his sort of character in the beginning here, in terms of, like, building up his sort of, I guess, just sort of showing what he's capable of doing, his political sort of dealings, how he's able to sort of, like, just sort of imitate things that are going on, either from, like, a real legal perspective or from behind sort of, like, a legal perspective here. So no, I think you definitely, like you said, they definitely show, like, his cleverness, his sort of, like, his ability just to sort of, show, or just get people sort of on his side, despite him, not having perfectly the sort of best sort of intentions. Like, he has a lot of tact. He's sort of, I guess you could sort of compare him to Zhao in some regard, in terms of, like, having a lot of sort of self-interested in sort of what he's trying to do, while in his own way thinking he's doing it for the best reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you definitely get that. Like, he is trying to, like, we learned at the end of the episode, he's trying to gain control over the city in the right way, opposite to what his father did. But we see that he's doing this by basically, like, bribing people, manipulating people. So it's not that he is this, like, heroic character really at all. And it's already got to a point where, like, things are beginning to get out of hand for him. But it seems to have worked at this point in the episode, where, like, he has control of the chief of police because he's outed Lin. He has Saikan in his pocket, basically. Korra's out of his way, which was his main opposition. He's completely taken apart Team Avatar. Tenzin is really the only one who, like, is still suspicious of him. But because Tenzin's going to be more focused on finding Korra, Tenzin's out of the way. The setup at this point seems to more be like, oh, like, Tarlok is going to bring the force of the city against the Equalists, and we're maybe going to get this massive war between these two powers of like Amon and Tarlok. But of course, we see some of the other characters come back into play here, and most notably here, I guess the plot rolling here is that Lin has mostly recovered and gets back to trying to get her officers back. But in this case, it's more like, oh, we've heard about what happened, we need to get Korra back. And so we get Lin breaking Asami, Mako, and Bolin out, and when she says that, when she tells them that Korra's missing, we see Mako especially is very eager to get going on this. And they really emphasize the idea that everyone's concerned, but Mako is like especially concerned, and that's one of the main sort of like drama setups of this episode, is that like Asami is a little bit concerned for like the intensity that Mako is trying to go after Korra with here. But I definitely like Lin getting back involved here. I like the moment where she puts the armor back on, but takes the badge off, you know, referencing the scene from like a few episodes back where she said she was going to do it outside of the law. Because again, Saikan is in Tarlok's pocket, and they're aware to a certain degree that like Tarlok, they're not going to get anywhere dealing with him. But what are your thoughts on this scene here with that kind of Lin kind of getting the plot going here?
Yeah, no, I think, like you said, that's always like, you know, I guess a cool scene to see how Lin, you know, she's not 100% or anything like that, but, you know, she's good enough, and, you know, she has the drive and the determination that, you know, she wants to get her officers back, and she needs some help, so she's able to break out the brothers and Asami, because of course she would know how to do that, as in being the former chief just recently. You know, it's a nice setup to sort of get the action actually rolling on the scenes, and, you know, getting them all to the point where they all know that they have to work together to free Korra, or find Korra and free, you know, the rest of her officers.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, the next section of this section of the plot is actually quite cool, as like they all figure out together, okay, if it was the Equalists who captured her, where would they be? And they figure out, oh, they must be underground, because Bolin, from earlier on in the season when you were taken, that's the only thing that explains how like they got away, is that they went underground. And so they go back to basically the scene where they sort of lost track of where Bolin was. Seismic sense, Lin is revealed that she has it here, and they find the entrance into the sort of like underground base of the Equalists here. And again, there's a little bit more kind of drama stuff, as like Asami basically forces Bolin to reveal what the Mako Korra connection is, and he reveals that Mako and Korra kissed once, and this is obviously this frustrates Asami. Inside, like it's quite a bit of the episode as we go through the Equalist base here, but for the most part they like stealthily make their way in. They're quite intelligent in how they do it. They take out a couple of Equalists along the way. They do find Lin's officers, but their bending has already been taken, and Mako forces one of the Equalists to reveal that they don't have the Avatar. They never attacked City Hall, and he obviously believes them. They believe him, and so they realize, wait, if the Equalists didn't do it, then who did? And Tenzin is the one to figure out that, like, oh, Tarlok lied, he's tricked us, he has Korra. And so they basically make their escape at this point. Cool scene, like the lieutenant has a trap set up for them, but Lin just like earthbends them through the through the roof basically. Again, it's quite a large sequence of the episode of just they get in and out relatively efficiently here, but it's a good team ultimately here, and there's some nice character moments. It's you see Mako some of the first stages of him like being a good detective, as he's the one to kind of give them the lead on how to find the underground tunnels. But it's mostly Lin leading this section of the episode. But what are your thoughts on what happens on this side of the plot?
Yeah, I think Lin does a good job of being sort of like the first person in command in this sort of situation as they're trying to sort of recover her officers, find Korra. I mean, you know, I guess that sort of makes sense with all the experience that she has, that she would just sort of naturally sort of gravitate towards that position. But, you know, the whole group of them, you know, play their roles in either sort of like, you know, getting into the location or getting us close to it, or just doing some quick airbending to sort of knock people out here. So no, I think it definitely, it is sort of like intriguing sort of, I guess, set piece here, just because you do get to see, at least part of the Equalists, how they function, how they're able to use these sort of trail cars in order to, get to different places. So you can see that they have everything like pretty well networked here. Like they have a whole section just for, the prison for keeping people here, which, the overall area looks like it's a lot larger than what they actually have there at that current time there. So no, I think it's definitely like just a cool set piece here to have things going around. And I know the way that they always escape from it, I think that always stands out to me, just because of how sort of like, it could have been like sort of like a huge big battle there where, they probably would have like not come out on top of that, but they're able to sort of just like avoid the whole situation because they've learned at this point that, tackling a whole bunch of them, especially with the down officers, probably isn't the right choice here. So I always like the fact that they just go through the ceiling and then just are able to sort of escape really quickly.
Yeah, I assume Lynn was able to use seismic sense to realize what was above them, because otherwise they could have come out like through a building or something like that. But yeah, this section of the episode, yeah, pretty good. Kind of notable, kind of like little point is that Mike and Brian voice two of the Equalists in there. It's like their book one kind of like cameo thing. You can definitely tell which one it was, especially the one that Brian voices. I think you can definitely tell. But that's just a quick little thing. So after this, we get they obviously go back to Tarlok. They confront him, and this is where everything basically begins to sort of like kind of come out. We'll come back to the Korra section of the episode in a minute, but he just like bloodbends everyone after the page kind of is the one to reveal it all, that like, he actually stuck around and saw the confrontation, saw the Tarlok as a bloodbender, and I love how they're already suspicious of him, but the second the page says that he's a bloodbender, like Lin and Tenzin especially just go completely on like the defense. They're like, oh, this guy's dangerous, like we gotta like battle stance, get ready. But of course Tarlok is so powerful, he just does some minor hand movements and suddenly everyone's blood bent, everyone's knocked out, and he's able to escape back to where Korra is. This is definitely one of those scenes that really gets across that, like, okay, when you're having the discussion about powerful bending techniques, this scene is, I think, the biggest highlight of it. That this is technically our weakest special bloodbender, but he's still able to take out like a who's who of some of the most powerful benders in Korra, just like that, and they're sort of like prepared for what he's about to do, and he still just completely takes them out with ease. But obviously this is where it begins to kind of go off the rails. He's been kind of outed here, all because of his page. I like this scene. It's a quick scene, but I think it's a really strong, dramatic scene. But what are your thoughts on the outing of Tarlok here?
Yeah, no, it definitely has a very dramatic, like, sort of feel to it, just because, this is really where you get to see sort of it, used in like a sort of like a group setting, because he used it against Korra, but she wasn't quite sort of like ready for it or in any sort of sense. Like here they had like some warning, like you said, like two of them were on guard for this because they knew overall what could actually be done with this sort of ability here. But yeah, it really just shows you that this is one of those abilities that unless you really have a really strong counter to it, or you really have like the element of surprise or something like that, like there's, if the person is sufficiently powerful against you and your own sort of bending prowess, that there's only so much that you can do, at least in sort of like the short form time here. So no, it definitely gets across how strong he is in this case, and just sort of how desperate that he is, that he's willing to use technique. Like I'm sure he probably didn't want to use it in this case here because he thought he could sort of like salvage things, but he really does realize that there's nothing he can do at this point in time.
Yeah, and it is interesting because just this information coming out sort of ruins his plan kind of almost completely. Which is kind of what the same thing that happens to Amon later. It's just that the knowledge of him being a bender, or especially a bloodbender, alone ruins the plan, because suddenly it's not just Korra he needs to keep out of the way. He then would need to keep Korra plus this whole group of characters and get them out of the way, to keep up the act of what's going on. So at this point, he basically decides that, like he says to Korra later, he just has to kind of get out, escape, start again somewhere else. Basically try and achieve power somewhere else and gain power that way. It's interesting to just see him immediately like readjust and want to kind of do the same thing again. But that's that. This, I suppose, brings us to the Korra side of the episode, which again is she tries to break out. She realizes she's not going to get anywhere. She can't metal bend at this point, and she's not going to have like a Toph moment where she discovers it on the spot here. So she uses this time to like meditate on what Aang was trying to tell her, which is what Tenzin told her to do. So because she's not forced into this situation where the only thing she can do is this, she's able to do it. She gets the full vision, not fractured this time, and we cut out of it like I think 2 or 3 times, but let's just kind of cover the flashback in full here. It's a really cool sequence here where it doesn't include all of the ATLA cast, in that it's like Aang, Sokka, Toph, and then Yakone primarily, and that's kind of it for the most part. And it's basically just Yakone is arrested because he's accused of basically committing a bunch of crimes where bloodbending was apparently involved. His defense, which he thinks is foolproof, is that the timing that's on record is that it was always done on a day when it wasn't a full moon. And everything anyone knows about bloodbending, they know it has to be done during a full moon. So he's basically being accused of something that is impossible. You can't bloodbend without a full moon. Sokka gives the big kind of reveal of the episode, which is that they find him guilty because, in their minds, in a way, like, bending isn't so set in stone. And he lays out the sort of examples of a few years ago, metal bending didn't exist. Like that, effectively, bending can evolve. People can be born with special abilities that are different than what you expect bending to be. We don't think it is impossible for anyone to ever bloodbend without the full moon being around. We believe you are a special bender who can do that at any time. And because of that, because of all the evidence, when you just get that one fact and, explain the technique that way, it all fits that he actually did it. And so he's found guilty on this sort of, in a way, new ruling effectively about the existence of special benders. And it was a big reveal at the time, because I don't even remember necessarily like what the discussions on bending techniques were like prior to that, but this really helped to sort of like almost like structure a lot of those discussions with the idea of like, okay, there can just be, in a way, random new people with special techniques, and it's that idea of some people can seemingly be born with just the ability for like a crazy high-powered bending technique. So just on the, I suppose, flashback up to there, what are your thoughts on the setup here with Yakone and the trial here, getting to see Sokka in such a like powerful position here?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, seeing Sokka, of course, that's always like cool to see, because that's something that everyone's wanted to see. Any of our characters being older, I think it's always like something that's stood out, just in general. But I think the whole scenario of it, I think it works well. The fact that it's at trial is something in Republic City, sort of like in its more early-ish stages. We can see that like any place in the world, it's not perfect. There's issues that they have to deal with, and this is their current way of dealing with those situations. And the idea that they're considering and they're open to the idea that people with more abilities and what they might know of, and I think it's also cool cool that, of course, they picked Sokka to say this because of everything that he's had to do in the past, and just the idea of him being in this position where we know before that he sort of like struggled a little bit in sort of the leadership's positions, or was doubting himself. So the whole idea that he's the one that's doing this, it adds to it for people who remember the original series, and for those who don't, it just seems like a cool moment nonetheless here. So I think it definitely works for me, just the fact that this is something that can develop over time, these sort of abilities. And yeah, it definitely did. I think even more so opened the idea of just more sort of bending techniques, more sort of abilities that could be used, rather than just sort of being stuck with something more along the lines of like your typical sort of like element type of bendings, other than sort of other things that have come out, like some of the other sort of like odd throwaway sort of bending techniques that they've shown in like some of the other extra media. But no, I think it's definitely a cool start for this section.
Yeah, because it's a nice way to explain what was, for everyone from the previous episode, this like, you've broken the rules. Like, you can't bloodbend with the full moon. Like, Korra was shocked that it happened to her. How is this working? And so instead of sort of the explanation otherwise maybe being like, oh, if anyone just trains with bloodbending, they can learn to do it without the full moon, they more take the approach of like, no, Yakone and then his family is special because they can just kind of do this kind of like easier than anyone else, that there's a natural sort of like power increase. And especially the mention of like Combustion Man here by Sokka, I think is a very key one. That's like the weirdest ability in like all of Avatar, that they're putting this in the same bracket as that, I think helps to kind of bring it all together. But yeah, he's found guilty, but this is when he does what Tarlok, we've already discussed, he did. But obviously Yakone does it in an even more impressive way, where he just opens his eyes a little bit wider to get across the idea that just with his mind, he takes control of every single person in the courtroom. And there's a massive amount of people there. Like, Tarlok took over a large amount of people, but Yakone has taken over like 5 times as many people here. And it includes, of course, like an Avatar, one of the most powerful benders in the world in Toph, and so many other characters as well. All while basically not moving like at all. Like, this is the extent of this ability to really get across that, yeah, this isn't just, slightly learning bloodbending a little bit more. This is a whole other level, that this is like a super powered bender that we are dealing with here. And so he just like kind of manhandles, Toph, Aang, and then he makes his escape. And I suppose we'll just talk about that there, because it's one of the most kind of like impressive displays of bending in like the entire series, is just controlling an entire courtroom of people. Like, that's a display that we don't see on that level that much. Like, Avatar State is like that level of impressive, but you don't see it that often from, a non-Avatar, basically. What are your thoughts on how Yakone responds to the guilty verdict?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really goes in line with what you were saying earlier about this really being more than just learning the technique and the ability, which, in theory, anyone of sufficient power and waterbender, could potentially learn this technique and, could do it with the full moon. But, the fact that he's able to do the whole courtroom without, any sort of hand movements as far as we can tell. And then, once he does get his hands released, can go even further with it, really speaks to just sort of the technique, the strength, and just sort of, how just, overpowered it actually is in this case here. And, how, maybe this is something that really pushed him over an edge in just sort of his character and why he's, able and wants to do the things that he wants to do. But it definitely stands out, I think, for pretty much anyone who's watched the show in terms of just like how it's used in this case here. And I'm sure if they wanted to, they could go even further with this, but this is how they chose to use it, and it definitely works to great effect, especially with like his bit of monologuing there as well.
And of course, in the middle of all this, we of course find out that bloodbending is illegal in Republic City. Like, it's a new law, and that Yukon is the one to actually say that it was Katara who had it outlawed. So I'd love to know the specifics behind that, of like, was it just when they were like drafting
Yeah.
up the laws of Republic City that they decided like, oh, if there's going to be benders of all elements here, like we have to add in some caveats about this. But in a way, because bloodbending is like a secret technique, it's one of those weird things where like if you say it's illegal, you're basically telling everyone it exists in the first place. So I wonder like what the specifics on that are, because of course Hama wasn't killed, like she was just like held prisoner again. So how public did bloodbending go because of that, or did other people in the aftermath, the decades since, like did other people find out about this technique and use it, and so Katara realized that she needs to make it public to outlaw it, and it's an interesting one to consider because of course we don't see Katara here, whereas you almost get the impression that if there was anyone who in the room could have maybe fought a little bit through Yukon's power, it probably would have been Katara, because she has experience directly with this technique. She probably wouldn't have been able to break out, but I think it would have been a cool thing to show her as being the one maybe capable of moving through it a little bit. So that is an interesting one. But what are your thoughts on that? That even though Katara isn't shown in any of this, she actually kind of ends up playing like a key role in the events around it.
Yeah, no, that definitely is something to consider. Like, what are the situations or the circumstances that, made it such a, like, hated ability? Like, I mean, it almost makes me think that, it might have actually been used in some other case, to great detriment that, really, pushed it to being a law here. Because, if it was a secret, like you're trying to say, then, it really does seem like, it wouldn't be around that much for people to know about it. But, I would suspect that, after everything goes on, like, the knowledge and information spreads across, even, with, what you might consider slower spread of information compared to, like, say, what we can do now and stuff. So, but yeah, no, definitely, makes you curious, how would have, Katara fared in sort of like a battle with, these characters here. But, I don't know. It's something we might never know.
Yeah, like I suppose they do kind of get across the idea that because Katara can't heal Korra, that the blood bending abilities that this family is capable of doing does seem to go beyond her capabilities, even if she was to use blood bending herself. Because obviously the way Amon takes away bending is like it's like internal kind of blood bending, kind of chi blocking type stuff. So you could technically, I suppose, reverse that with like internal blood bending healing, which Katara theoretically would be capable of doing, but she doesn't want to use blood bending ever. So there's that kind of interesting point. But the end of the flashback is Aang does chase Yukon. Cool little Avatar state scene as he just powers up, giant kind of air scooter, air ball, to see that evolution. Takes out Yukon's transport, and right as Aang is kind of going to go in to kind of take Yukon back into custody, he's captured by Yukon's bloodbending grip. And it's a really brutal scene here as we see Yukon just sort of loses it and is basically planning to just like kill Aang by like snapping his limbs completely. It's pretty wild the angles that Aang's limbs are at here as he's nearly about to be taken out. But of course the Avatar state activates and this completely counters the bloodbending grip. Aang takes Yukon's bending away, kind of highlighting that like this is a bender so dangerous that this was the only option, that given that Aang has this ability, this was just an instant, this is what I have to do here. There's no real other solution. He is too dangerous to keep that level of bending. And that's the situation. Aang was trying to show Korra this vision to warn him of the threat of basically bloodbenders of this lineage, people who have this power of bloodbending, including Tarlok. And the obvious connection from there is that it's a bloodline, And so Korra is able to figure out that Tarlok is Yakon's son. So that's the big reveal coming out of the end of it. But what are your thoughts on the end of that flashback? Aang nearly being killed, another villain gets their bending taken away.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember just really like getting people really into just sort of like, Aang and his abilities and just sort of, what he can do when he's older here. And I think people were really hyped to see this sort of flashback here. And it's definitely a cool scene here just to get to see, sort of like adult characters really bending at sort of like, peak level basically for this scene here, and just to see sort of like how dangerous it really is here. Like you really can go too far with bending, and that's almost what sort of happened in this instance here. And yeah, like you definitely get sort of like I guess a more mature or older perspective on Aang and how he deals with certain situations, at least in this sort of extreme case here. So no, it definitely has a lot going on here that you can sort of think about.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, this is where all the kind of plots begin to line up. She comes out of this vision. Tarlok arrives back. She basically, realizes, I figured it out. You're Yakon's son. Yes. And Tarlok reveals that, yeah, my plan was to do things in the opposite way of my father. He tried to be like the underworld, crime lord controlling the city. I'm trying to do things in a way the right way by achieving like an actual valid position in the city, gaining control that way. But basically that you and your allies have ruined it completely. This is where he says he's going to try and start again, and basically just leaves her there and goes to leave and escape to who knows where. But this is when we get the shocking moment of this episode, which is that Amon is just right there with a bunch of equalists waiting for him at the top of the stairs. And he is like stunned. I think everyone is stunned seeing this crazy confrontation, because it's kind of been the Tarlok show for the last, episode or two. That Amon did his attack on the headquarters, the pro bending arena back in episode 6. We dealt with Hiroshi in episode 7, but it's been Tarlok focused since episode 8. So here's Amon like appearing out of nowhere once again to, in this case, cement that, no, I'm the main villain. I'm the more powerful one. We've just spent a whole episode getting across that Tarlok is like obscenely powerful. That like basically only an avatar is more powerful than bloodbending of this level, and he's able to bloodbend all of Amon's equalists, and it works sort of on Amon, but Amon just is slowed down. He basically just walks through it, and eventually the bloodbending grip is broken, and Amon just takes out Tarlok, takes his bending away, and interestingly, Amon chooses to kind of in a way like dispose of Tarlok himself. Not something you'd think from like your main villain to like actively like have Tarlok like over his back being like, oh yeah, I'll take him to the headquarters, given that like he's technically powerless at this point. Why is the leader focusing on him so much? And so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, but crazy reveal there, just like, Tarlok is the most powerful character in the series at this point. Nope, it's Amon, and you don't know where to think. This was the aftermath of this episode was definitely when the fandom was at its like craziest for Korra, because this was really where people had already been saying like what is Amon, but this was definitely when the like what is Amon came out, and the theories of like, oh my god, is he like a robot or something like that this doesn't work because there's no blood or what. I'm not sure that there was many people who figured out that Amon was also like a bloodbender at this point, but interesting and crazy reveal here. Well, what are your thoughts on this shocking scene?
Yeah, is he a cyborg or something like that? But yeah, it's definitely a shocker of a scene, just in terms of how they set Tarlok up to be, like you said, someone who's pretty powerful, who has these abilities that no one has seen before, which is what he, says a direct line in this section here. And, it definitely works on everyone but Amon here. And, of course, eventually we do figure out how that actually works here. But without knowing the full scope of things, it definitely just seems like, he almost has these otherworldly abilities, which of course is what they've been trying to trump up for the whole show here. So, none of the other, equalists can actually really see because they're all knocked out. I think the lieutenant is like the last one to go down and, tries to struggle a little bit more, but they're pretty much all succumb to his abilities here. But yeah, definitely, it's all perfectly set up here to show that, he has some sort of direct interest in here. I don't think there's anything that really, gives it away in this instance here. But it definitely shows that, just how strong, both of these, I guess, villain-ish characters are at this point in time.
Yeah, because like Amon is it's weird, like the information that you have at this point, because you have to go back to like episode 3, where what Amon said was that he was given the power to take bending away by the spirits, and you're kind of like, is that a lie? Is that the truth? Maybe. There's no obvious hint that he is a bender at this point. Yes, when you, like, in hindsight have the information that he's also a bloodbender, you get the idea of like, it's just a battle of bloodbending grips, and Amon is more powerful than Tarlok, and so he can just walk through it in the same way that Katara was able to walk through Hama's grip. It's that sort of thing, where like, same ability, it's just a battle of kind of wills, who is more powerful. That's what's actually happening here. But because Amon is such a mystery, like you don't make the obvious kind of decisions up to this point, because it's like, why after a whole episode to lead up to the reveal that Tarlok is related to Yakone, would they also reveal like a secret other son? But that is actually the reveal, so it's really cool. And this was where all the crazy stuff came out. The really notable, probably the most like famous like fake image in like the fandom of like the mask off and it being like sort of like an older Aang who's like somehow still alive, that got like so many people who thought it was real. That was a kind of crazy situation that kind of explained things, but it was also like, what? But yeah, it was a crazy time in the fandom back then, definitely with all the mystery, and to the point like we didn't really get it that much after that, because there wasn't too much mystery surrounding sort of like book 2, 3, and 4. Maybe the whole early book 4, like what's going on with Korra situation, but the mysteries of book 1 was like where people were freaking out completely because they had no idea what was going on. So after this, Korra needs to get out of here, so she avoids the electrocution of the box quite cleverly here, plays like she's knocked out, and then uses this opportunity to escape. She is quite clever here. This is where you see the growth of the character. She's more patient. She decides to flee rather than like standing and fighting, and so manages to get away. Naga finds her, set up from earlier on that like they couldn't find Naga either, so Naga had obviously left to find Korra, and Naga brings Korra back to the city, and that's where everyone kind of reunites at the end of the episode with another kind of shipping drama moment where Mako takes Korra from Naga and kind of like is holding on to her as he like walks straight by Asami to highlight that. This is obviously one of those ones where it's like, I get what you're going for here, but like when the focus of the scene is just that Korra is okay, it's a little bit weird to use this as like a romance kind of drama setup moment, but that's just like the early stages of the romance and what they decided to focus on versus not. Ultimately, it's a nice emotional moment that Naga, Korra's closest friend, is the one to find her and bring her back to the city. It's a nice kind of use of Naga, and just bringing things back together of like, okay, all the characters are kind of back in their right places. We've had our Tarlok arc for now, and Amon still remains the overall threat in this. But you're so like lost in thought over all these reveals. You're like, where do we even like stand after this. It's been a roller coaster. But what are your thoughts on the end of this episode?
Yeah, it definitely does, make you think like what's really happening or who's really who in different situations here. Because it is, at least at this point in time, is quite sort of like up in the air in terms of like who's really like, I guess, moving different pieces around the board, or who really has the bigger pictures of things. But yeah, it's nice to see, that Korra's, able to get away from her captors in this case here. Like, she does try to do a little bit of, moves in order to sort of like fight Amon, but, she's pretty quick and decisive, either because of just desperation or just energy levels, or, whatever state that she's currently in, that she chooses to get away. And yeah, it is a really good use of Naga in order to find her, because, who else would be looking for her but her faithful animal companion here. And yeah, it does seem like, I guess, a bit odd that they're, pushing the romance at this situation here. I mean, at least they did state it, from like the beginning of the episode, that Mako's like overly worried about her, even, if that causes, issues later on, which is where some people fall out with the whole sort of romance way that they're going with things here. But no, it is good that they have all the characters sort of back together at this point.
I think it's just a difficult dynamic to make work in a way that doesn't just feel like you're going for romance, because otherwise you have to present Asami as sort of being like basically annoyed that Mako agrees with her that it's a concern that Korra is missing, but it's a problem that he's too concerned. And then like, what does that mean, that you're like too concerned for someone's safety and all that sort of stuff? Like, I get they're linking into the like, oh, he likes her more than me type situation, but I never feel like that's the best way to go with these kind of drama things, is to just separate those two things. Let the romance be the romance, but let the kind of characters caring about each other kind of be that way. And I think they do this quite a bit actually throughout Korra with a lot of the romance stuff, is that they do let like other stuff which isn't inherently related to the romance like affect the romance quite a bit, when the focus should just be that, hey, this character's hurt or this character's in a bad situation. We're all concerned about her. It doesn't matter who's the most concerned necessarily. I get they're building up the plot of effectively Mako sort of has to, like, in a way, choose here. He's in a relationship with Asami, but it's becoming clear that he cares more about Korra. But I think they could have done that a little bit better. But I think you need way more episodes, I think, to do that effectively. The problem here is that it's sort of compressed, and I think that's what people's like issue is with a lot of the romance, is that you are tying it into the drama of other stuff as well, and that takes away from it like a little bit. But what are your thoughts just like throughout this episode and what they did with the romance stuff? For the most part, it was a lot of like Asami like dirty looks basically in this episode.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes you can do like the stress of the situation and have the romance work out really well. But I think in this case here, which, goes with what a lot of people is just, having the third party interested in this situation just sort of like muddles the situation a bit there, because, the triangles themselves are always sort of like, depending on, your perspective on them, can always be a bit sort of like iffy in general. So when you add that with sort of like the heat of the moment here, it also just makes it a little bit more sort of, I guess, unwieldy with the way that, it can be taken in different sort of situations. So I think that's, that sort of just makes it, a little bit odd here. And the fact that, one, sort of is sort of figuring this out, sort of from bits and pieces from the side here, and one, Mako's not really, aware at all of what he's really doing in the situation, just makes it, just seem a little bit sort of like out of hand from sometimes.
Yeah, and then you also get the sort of like almost getting the details of the scenes kind of like almost slightly wrong to create more drama, in that Bolin tells Asami just randomly that, oh, they kissed this one time. And obviously Asami interprets that as like, oh, but this was when me and him were together, so Mako has done something wrong, even though it was like Korra who initiated the kiss. But we can't really blame Korra now because she's like half unconscious over there, and we were so concerned about her all this time. And so the blame really gets shifted onto Mako for just sort of like being in this situation, like, and all this stuff happening. As I've said many times before, like, I think they ultimately resolve it like pretty well within the book. In episode 11, I think the scene where we'll get to it. But then they just reignited it in book 2, which I'm excited to get to just discuss these scenes again. But thankfully there's a clear like massive shift in how they do romances in my mind, starting from book 3, where they decide not to be as drama focused as they were here. I think there's an element that they were like, oh, the shipping drama from Avatar, let's like bake that into the show itself. Whereas I think the takeaway from Korra probably should be, let the shipping stuff happen naturally rather than doing it yourselves. Because you'll get the drama just within the fandom. You don't need to have the drama like directly in the show. Because I think people will be annoyed at Avatar if they had actually done like Katang versus Zutara like in the show itself. And I hope as we go forward they stay away from that sort of stuff. But what's your take on it, in a way, like why they took this approach with the romance, when the romance in ATLA in general I think was pretty well praised by most people ultimately for how it was done, outside of weird shipping drama stuff that is very internal fandom stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if they're just trying to sort of go with along the lines of the characters being, somewhat more mature in this case here, so they're trying to sort of like emphasize that those situations happen more often, which is true, but for storytelling purposes and what they're going for, maybe that's not sort of the ideal, or maybe just because this is season 1 and at the time in the development of where it could go in the future wasn't quite as clear, and they thought that might make it more interesting for the limited amount of runtime that they had at that point in time. I'm sure there's like a couple different ways, they might have considered it for things going on. Although even with it being sort of a short amount of time, you think that, maybe that might not be something that you would want to focus on quite as much. But, I guess that's sort of the route that they went for this one here, which seems to, generally, not be as preferred as opposed to the original way that they did in the series. But of course, they had a lot more episodes there as well.
Mm-hmm. But there are reviews for this week. Next podcast, we'll be doing 3 episodes. So obviously for Korra, we're going to be doing K110, Turning the Tides. And then for Avatar, we'll be doing both 114, The Fortune Teller, as well as 115, Botto of the Water Tribe. So 2 of the more sort of low-key episodes there for Avatar. I like The Fortune Teller, but I think it's hard to argue that it's like a super, super important episode. And then Botto of the Water Tribe is one of those weird episodes where like there's a cool fight scene at the end and some cool ideas, but is ultimately an episode that most people, it's not really their favorite. So it's kind of like, say, the live action show coming up, it feels like I think they're going to skip a lot of these 2 episodes. We know they have like I think an actress for June, so they're obviously including her, but will it be in the context of this episode? Wait and see. But that Korra episode, Turning the Tides, is very dramatic. There's just like boom, 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 action, 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 and some big emotion in that one as well. So as we said before, ever since we hit the mid-season point in Korra Book 1, it's been just like amazing episode after amazing episode, and I think it continues with episode 10. So what are your thoughts on this next group of episodes we're going to review?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that the Korra one, like you said, is definitely like, I mean, I guess all of these ones, they have a lot of things going on for them just because of how short and how compact things are. So there's always something to look forward to them. And yeah, for the Avatar ones, I mean, there are ones that I do remember them just because of like various things that happen inside of the episodes, mainly more the sort of like action focused things. But I think, Battle of the Water Tribe is an interesting one just because you get more history and more, just more knowledge of the water tribes and things that are going around there, and sort of Sokka and his sort of backstory there. I mean, yeah, it's not definitely the most important thing, and sort of the pettiness of Aang in some of that episode, can get a little bit sort of like annoying there, but they do have like at least a sort of nice sort of rounding out of it at the end of that episode at least.
Yeah, like the next run of ATLA episodes is definitely one where like you maybe wish they'd spread some of these episodes differently across the book. And it's probably like for the live action, actually probably one of the tougher groups of episodes to do because they're all like relatively different episodes. You got like a romance episode into sort of like a Sokka character development episode into like Zhang character becomes very important later on, and then the Northern Air Temple is just like an unusual episode that I'm excited to actually review again because I never know where to put that one myself. But just in terms of like the next groupings of episodes, obviously next week we're doing Korra 110, Avatar 114, 115. The episode after that we'll be doing Korra 111, and also episode 16 and 17. So the Deserter and Northern Air Temple. The one after that will be an interesting was the first finale we're going to do. So we're going to do the Korra Book 1 finale and also 118, Waterbending Master from Avatar. And that will be followed by another sort of finale episode where we do Korra Season 2 opener with the 2-part finale for Avatar Book 1. So that's the kind of fun way of doing them both side by side, is we get a kind of couple of finales back to back, and the offset between the lengths of the books will then begin to start as well. So that'll be kind of fun as well as we go forward. And with our pacing quickly surpass how far Brave and the Elephants have gotten, which is going to be a funny thing. Because like they're only going on to like 208 I think or something like that, 208, 209, and we'll be there in just a couple of weeks. In terms of like number of episodes we've covered, but anyway, so yeah, I think that overall has been the episode. Like I said, we'll be back next time out with 3 reviews for Avatar and Korra, and hopefully news on the Quest for a Balance game. I'm guessing that might be probably the next thing that actually pops up, hopefully, because I think everyone is interested in to see what a new Avatar video game is, even if we don't have too high expectations. But it's been episode 251 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.